Hey guys, second video here, second lesson. This is the lesson number 2 on Jonah. Last week was kind of an introduction. This week we're going to be looking at chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. I really didn't want to get into the next block, which we've been in chapter 1, verses 7 and on. It's kind of a whole different section, so I went ahead and stopped it here. When I went through it, practiced, it took about 24 minutes roughly to go through the lesson. Obviously didn't take time to have discussions with myself about the questions. So hopefully you should be able to pull this out into 35, 40 minutes roughly. Hopefully it goes well. If it goes too short, be sure and let me know. And we can maybe change some stuff for the other classes. So, start off with a review. Don't know how much in depth you'll have to be. I think the big points to make on the review is, we spent the first few weeks of this year talking about, the idea that, the Bible is one story about Christ, and we're going to see a lot of connections to Christ in the book of Jonah. That, there's not a lot of details, but the details that we have are very important. The Bible is made up of narrative and poetry and prose discourse, but this is a narrative. So as a result, we looked at the plot. Well, we're going to look at the plot as we go through it, but we looked at the characters and the setting, and you can bring up whatever you need to bring up of that part there in the class. You might remind them of a couple parts. I think one thing important to bring up and let it set in is that the historical setting that I mentioned about Nineveh, and I think this is important because it shows that God was at work in Nineveh also preparing for what Jonah's going to do. Now, that we're not going to really discuss that today, but I think as you move into chapter 3, especially that's important that, Nineveh had expanded so quickly that they were unable to really govern. They were having famines, they were having plagues. As a result of that, regional governors were revolting, so the king had to pull back troops. And as a result, there's also a solar eclipse, which never goes well because people question their gods and the king. So a lot of things God's doing in Nineveh that we can look back historically and see that are preparing for what Jonah's going to do. So, go over what you need to go over, make sure people are aware of it. So with that in mind, let's get into the story. Jonah. We start off with Jonah 1 through 3. And one of the things that we're going to be hitting a lot on today, and even in the next week, is fear. We'll take a look at, what is fear of the Lord? How does God expect us to fear Him, but yet not let the fear affect us? A lot of stuff over in the Gospels that we'll be taking a look at. So let's get into it. Jonah 1 through 3, it says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord." So what do we see? Well, Jonah's given the word of the Lord to take to Nineveh. We remember that Jonah's a prophet. We looked at that last week over in 2 Kings. That he had been given the word of the Lord before. In other words, this isn't the first time. You might remind him of that he had to take a really a good word that this King Jeroboam II was the king of Israel, and that he was going to have great success if he wanted to go to battle and would win. And, this king, he's an evil king, it says. And but yet Jonah had to bring a good word to him. And, how did that work out for Jonah? How do you think it made him feel? We're going to talk about it some more. I think this is important, just to kind of get into that mindset. Verse 3, we see that Jonah, he rises. A lot of times when you see that, but Jonah rose. Abraham rose early in the morning. Anytime people rise up, we usually think they're going to do God's will. That phrase, when they rose, is usually a sign that whoever's about to do it is going to go do what God told them. But Jonah doesn't do that. He instead goes in the opposite direction. So, we kind of see a first, really design element that the author is using here. And it's the idea that he's juxtaposing Jonah and your typical prophet in the Bible. Every other story before this, after this, when a prophet receives a word from the God, he does what is asked of him. You think about Moses. He has some initial arguments that he has with God. I can't speak well. I stutter. I do this. I do that. But, God eventually answers all of his questions and deals with his reasons not to do it. And Moses, as we know, goes and does it. It's only Jonah that we see a prophet that goes the opposite direction. So, ask your people, why do you think the author is telling us this story? Why is this in the Bible? What are the reasons that the author is using this contrasting approach? Because he's doing that intentionally. So talk about, I'll give you one answer. He's doing it as a heads up for us that there's going to be a lot of things in this story that we see and we may think are going to go one way, but they're going to go another. So, hopefully you get a little discussion on that. Then I have a reflection and discussion point, some points to consider here at the beginning. I said based on what we've already discussed about Nineveh above and last week, what initial reasons might Jonah have for not wanting to go to Nineveh? Could be fear, could be any number of things. And then number two, I said, kind of bringing it a little bit closer in based on what 2 Kings tells us about Jonah. One could go in another direction. Has Jonah been asked by God to be a prophet of God's undeserved mercy to another wicked king? Yeah, if people don't remember, remind them, Jeroboam too was a wicked king. But God gave him mercy just like he gives to you and I. So, was Jonah afraid that the Ninevites might repent? And if so, why wouldn't he want that to happen? To think about, because, you kind of get this idea in your mind that Jeroboam the second was an evil king. But if you go back and you read under 2 Kings, I think it's 14, underneath there, it says part of the reason God did this is because the people of Israel had cried out to him, and he took pity on them. But, now it's like, now God's asking Jonah to go into Nineveh, where not only do they have a wicked king, but the people are wicked in Jonah's mind. They're the bad guys, like we talked about. So, some discussion over why would Jonah be afraid of that? And, do we have those things in our lives? So, hopefully some good discussion, just kind of prepare you for this. Next thing I want to point out, design elements. One of the things that they'll do is repeated words. We're going to use words again and again and again, and when the author does that, it's there for a reason. So, you get this word Tarshish repeated 3 times, just like right there, boom. In verse 3 alone, it's 3 times. And so, we need to pay attention to that. So where is Tarshish? Hopefully you did your research on that. We talked about it last week. You might want to bring up a little bit more. If you go look at Psalm 139, 7 through 11, which there's no doubt that Jonah knew, he's attempting to flee from the presence of the Lord. But, you go look at Psalm 139, 7 through 11, maybe read it in your class. One line, verse 8 is really interesting. If I ascend to the heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. Remember that verse, that little line, when we get into chapter 2. What is it even, is Tarshish really away from the presence of the Lord? And then the second part there, go look at Isaiah 2, 12 through 16 and Psalm 48, 7. And you can see kind of God's view of Tarshish. And we talked about that, a little bit last week. It is this exotic place. Solomon was able to get gold and silver. And I think it says apes and peacocks there for a zoo, which, those things aren't bad. But as you see that story about Solomon, it's from Tarshish that these things came that, Solomon eventually allowed to kind of take over his heart and pull him away from it. So, you can see that God's view of Tarshish is not good. So it's ironic, you might bring this out in your class, that Tarshish is bad too. God has plans to destroy it also. So why does Jonah think he can flee there but not go to Nineveh? It's kind of a good juxtaposition, I guess, thing to look at. And then one more reflection thing just to think about, because I think this is important for us to think about too. This idea of fleeing from the presence of God. What does that even mean? I have that as a question to talk to your class about. What does it mean to try to flee from the presence of God? And do we try to do so today? And is it possible? Hopefully everyone would know that it's not. But, it's a good discussion. And then that other question, where in your life have you tried to get away from the presence of the Lord or His commands? We've all done it. We've all tried to get away from our conscience, whether it's actively doing something or just mentally not even wanting to think about it. So, and then after that, hopefully that's a good discussion on fleeing from the presence of God. And then I put a little joke in there about Jonah, because there's a lot of that stuff out there if you really research this. So as we move into fear, Jonah 4-6, the big thing is fear. And this is another one of those words that just like Tarshish is repeated again and again. And fear is going to be a big part of the rest of this chapter. And so it kind of gets introduced here. And I think the big picture here is that sometimes God will use terrifying situations so that we can learn to fear Him rightly. And I think that's important because we'll see that happen with the sailors. So, ask the question, what's it meant by the phrase to fear the Lord? And then talk about a couple of these questions, these verses below. The first one, of course, is Proverbs 1:7, which said, basically the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And, we will, that a wise fear, it demonstrates awe and reverence for God. When we fear Him, we should always have that. But when you go to like Matthew 10:26-31, Jesus teaches His disciples that we're not to fear people or situations in a way that shows a lack of trust in God's protection. So there's this balance in our life with fear that we'll kind of see with the sailors and the captain, but not with Jonah so much. This idea that we are to fear God, but that fear is the beginning of wisdom. But we're not to fear people and situations when we're doing God's work. So, some really good discussions there about how to have fear correctly. And it's going to be something we're going to talk about more as we move through that. So next part is the voyage. And this is the actual part into it where we move into verses 4-6. And begin looking at it, and it says, "But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship, and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came to him and said to him, 'What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish.'" So you get this scene of this horrible storm that God sends. The sailors seem to be afraid. That they could tell. Obviously, I think at this time probably everyone viewed storms like this as something sent by gods. They didn't necessarily view it as a meteorological situation. I guess they didn't have a Tom T. Ferteller or J. Gordon Lund to let them know about it, But, I found a great quote, actually in the book of Moby Dick. I don't know, I had to read that back in high school. I don't remember it very much. But, there's a whole section in there that has a sermon preached by this Father Mapple guy about Jonah. And I thought this one little section really kind of drew a pretty vivid picture of what's going on in verses 4-6. It says, "A dreadful storm comes on. The ship is like to break. But now when the boatswain calls all hands to lighten her, when boxes, bells, and jars are clattering overboard, when the wind is shrieking and the men are yelling, and every plank thunders with trampling feet right over Jonah's head, and all this raging tumult, Jonah sleeps his hideous sleep." And that's a great point. How does he stay asleep through this? Notice the fear there in verse 5. The sailors were afraid, and how each cry out to their own God. And then, when the captain finds Jonah, he's like, "Get up and call out to your God." We need every God on deck, working for us because something bad is happening. So, it's this idea that Jonah's sleeping through this storm. Of course, gospel connection is Jesus stilling the storm over in the Gospels. And it's in all three. It's in Matthew, Luke, and Mark. I picked the one from Mark because I think it's got a couple of points that are a little bit easier to make, to kind of keep in mind. And I mean, this story, you can tell when you go over to Mark and look at it that we're meant to think about Jonah in this situation and what's going on. But I do think it's interesting because this story shows us some stuff about Jesus. Number one, I think it shows us that he was human. That he he went to sleep. Put there, he's fallen asleep and seems to be able to sleep like Jonah through all the noise and the fury. And I think it reminds us of Jesus' humanity. And you go back and you read what's been going on in Mark before this. Jesus has been busy and he's just exhausted. And I think it's a good place for a discussion a little bit about just the human side of Jesus, that he was this tired. Now, we don't really know why Jonah is sleeping. I think it's depression, but you can kind of get into that yourself, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I think it's a good discussion. I put a question there. Does this knowledge of Jesus' human side make you feel a deeper connection to him? It should. I mean, we've all been there, especially today. Everybody's tired. Well, I'm not tired. I had a good night's sleep last night. My cell phone told me I did. But, it is something that we deal with. So, yeah, that's one thing. I think this story over in Mark, I'd read through it. Mark 4:35 through 41. Read through that story. I think it also shows Jesus as divine. And I think, Jesus is modeling this idea about no fear or anxious. Now, I put as God incarnate, Jesus knows that nothing bad is going to happen while he sleeps that couldn't be handled. And I mean, actually, you read his frustration with the disciples is that they didn't handle it. That they, freaked out and woke him up. And, I just thought it was very interesting. I think, to go back to it real quick, I think verse 41, in the story of Jesus still in a storm, says, "And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, 'Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" It's very, very interesting. It's that fear thing again that you see over in the book of Jonah. So, the story of Jesus and that we see in Mark, it shows us as Jesus as human. It shows us Jesus as divine. And then, I ask the question, is being worried or anxious a problem? Probably people won't admit to it, but it is a problem with people. Everybody deals with this in seasons of their life, But I think some people may be more prone to it and need to think about it because this story of Jonah and stuff deals a lot with fear. And then the third thing kind of pull out of this story of Jesus still in the storm is Jesus versus Jonah. Like I said, the stories in all three of the synoptic gospels. No doubt the comparison to Jonah was intentional. Both men were asleep during the storm, but their reactions to it couldn't be any different. Jonah is quick to volunteer to stop the situation by dying. And even though he speaks about God, he never asks God to help. He just says, "Throw me overboard and that'll take care of it." Jesus speaks very little, but his words immediately stop the storm because he uses his power and, does so in a way that it's so obvious to the disciples that they're like, "Whoa, who is this guy?" It's kind of like just saw Jesus 2.0, the next level. And, I think a good question is, Jonah's clearly hiding. Jesus is sleeping because he's sleepy. He's tired. Jonah's sleeping to hide. And I think, that's why I put that question. Do we, like Jonah, find ourselves hiding in the bottom of the ship from our own problems? I mean, it's easier sometimes to go just hide from our problems and deal with them, So hopefully a good discussion point for you there. The reactions, both groups, sailors, and the disciples are shown to react by being filled with great fear when God works in front of them. And a good question, I think. I thought a lot about this. Have you ever been filled with great fear or reverence at the work of God? If not, why not? A lot of times I don't think we think about God's work in our life and the life of others enough to be reverent or fearful. So, and then one final note, I think that one of the reasons I picked Mark is if you keep reading that, Jesus is on his way and actually goes to the Gentiles, unlike Jonah, who's trying to go somewhere else. So you get another counterpart there. And you'll see Jesus, if you keep reading, go over and exorcise the demons from the guy that had legion in him, and go from there. So, whereas Jonah's running from the Gentiles, Jesus is going to the Gentiles. And in kind of the final, I guess, reflection point and discussion from the whole lesson is, I like to think of the effects of ongoing sin. I mean, we see Jonah. Sin is that he thinks he can run from the Lord, and he's not going to do that. And this is going to be an ongoing thing. I put a quote here from Tim Keller, who's got a book called Rediscovering Jonah, which I think is a pretty good book. I pulled some material out of it. It says, the effects of Jonah's sin is immediate and dramatic. This is not the norm. The results of sin are more often like a small decay or a disease that at the beginning is hardly noticeable until it is too late. Sin always hardens a conscience, locks you in the prison of your own defensiveness and rationalization, and eats you up slowly from the inside. So, yeah, I mean, that's generally the way sin works. I mean, you think about a book like The Scarlet Letter, great book about sin and how it's just eating these people up, in there. And, to ask your people, does sin work like this? I mean, Jonah, we see it immediately, but here, sin is something God doesn't want in our lives. Even though we've been forgiven, we still need to deal with it. Like Doug talks about all the time, we need to repent and turn away. Repent means I lay it down and I turn away from it. So, good thing. And then that's kind of the basic lesson. Like I said, this video is about 23 minutes long, probably the time I'm done. So, hopefully you got enough material with discussion, a lot of good discussion here. Review, just give a quick review of what we went over, fear being the biggest thing. And then I put this thing in here about Jewish tradition says there's 4 things that make a prophet. You have insight, foresight, compassion, and courage. And, you have a good discussion here kind of towards the end. Did Jonah really meet any of the qualifications of a prophet? I gave you the definitions of insight, foresight, compassion, and courage. So hopefully a good discussion. Next week we'll move into the rest of Jonah 1. So hope everything goes well for you. I'll be praying for you. Thanks much.